I would like to speak about the transnational politics of sexual labor in the 10 years of the International Women's Decade, the 10 years that passed between the first three World Women's Conferences, which took place respectively in Mexico City in 1975, in Copenhagen in 1980, and in Nairobi in 1985. I will look specifically at how sexual labor was framed and negotiated in the context of the first two conferences under the headings of trafficking women, female sexual slavery, and sex work. One of the major goals of my broader project, which spans from 1945 to 1985, and this paper, is to go beyond the reification of the contemporary debates on sex work and trafficking, in which there are supposedly two clearly defined, diametrically opposed, and hermetically sealed stable positions on sexual labor, notably those who recognize sex work as labor and those who define it as sexual violence. I also want to avoid tracing and reconstructing linear and teleological histories of success or failure towards a political goal. I see my role as a historian to question current categories, conflict lines, and political demands as natural. In this sense, I focus on dynamics of engagement with sexual labor and stress the processes of construction, negotiation, and institutionalization of certain concepts over time. I am interested in moments of openness, uncertainty, as well as fluidity, where alliances, arguments, and demands were still in flux. It is for these reasons that I use the concept of sexual labor as an analytical category, which allows me to understand other descriptors such as trafficking, sexual slavery, prostitution, and sex work as historically specific ways to referring to sexual labor and formulating political demands. A variety of political actors were present at each of the conferences I mentioned, either as delegates of governments, international governmental organizations, such as the various UN sections or the UNESCO, non-governmental organizations such as the Anti-Slavery Society, but also less institutionalized grassroots movements and organizations such as Coyote, the English Collective of Prostitutes, or the Wages for Housework campaign. Reflecting both spatial and institutional power differentials, the conferences itself, and this is just very short, consisted of two settings. The official conference by the UN, where most state representatives were, and the so-called NGO forums, where in theory any women's topic with global relevance could be represented. And the second part is which I'm focusing on mostly. In my project, and this is relevant for today's talk, the history of the politics of sexual labor begins with the negotiation of the quote, the Convention for the Suppression of the Trafficking in Persons and the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others of 1949. This is relevant because at the UN level, conventions are shape, open up, and at once restrict the political spaces of opportunity for conceptualizing and formulating political demands, and also limit the actors that are heard and are not heard. In terms of the contents of the convention, it abolished so-called state-regulated prostitution, which, to make it very brief, included measures to register sex workers but also coerced gynecological examinations. It also targeted and criminalized the exploitation of the prostitution of others, which is a formula to refer to pimps. And thirdly, the convention aimed, although this is subject for debate, to the disappearance of sexual labor itself from so-called modern societies, and mandated for measures of prevention and rehabilitation of what were called victims of prostitution. Mostly the first two aspects were taken up during the International Women's Decade and adapted, appropriated, and translated based on the different contexts and background of various actors. So to become more concrete, at the Mexico City Women's Conference, the issue was brought up on the agenda by the director of the UNESCO Human Rights Division, Marie-Pierre Herzog, at a time when Amnesty International had just launched the International Campaign Against Torture. Herzog picked up the new language of human rights to speak about, quote, the problem of the torture of prostitutes. In her brief intervention, she spoke about special houses in which prostitutes were kept as captives and were submitted to, quote, tortures and other inhumane and degrading treatments, end of quote. Herzog delivered a graphic description of the plight of these women as having to submit to, quote, sexual perversions, of between 80 to 120 men every day. Contrary to Amnesty International's campaign where specific countries were identified as places of human rights violations, as the representative of an international governmental organization, Herzog was not allowed to name names. She found herself caught between acknowledging the reliability and seriousness of the sources on which her report was supposedly based, while at the same time pointing out that these sources did, quote, not point to any particular country, end quote. Unable to point to specific governments and potentially member states, she unwittingly shifted the understanding of human rights violations as being perpetuated by governments to include individual crimes of sexual violence. In this way, not only was the state elided from the equation, but unknown individuals in an unknown and unnameable place were framed as perpetrators. In terms of conceptualization of sexual labor, Herzog specifically denied referring to the so-called free prostitution, which she equated with outdoor prostitution on the streets, in cars and apartments. It is notable that Herzog, who was based in Paris, did not mention the protests that had been going on in France in the years leading up to 1975, and which culminated in the occupation of a church by prostitutes in the French city of Lyon at the beginning of June 1975, so just weeks before the World Women's Conference. According to press reports, approximately 200 women sought refuge in the church in order to escape the crackdown of the police. They protested arrests and fines, but also criminalization of their children and partners through the application of laws against so-called third parties, the one we've heard in the 1949 convention. They wanted to pay taxes instead of fines. They wanted social recognition and integration as sex workers rather than incarceration or rehabilitation. What they were protesting was at least partly the anti-prostitution framework of the UN 1949 convention itself, which made not only national protest, but international political activities particularly difficult. The emergence of prostitutes as political actors, and particularly this moment, which is currently interpreted as the founding moment of the international sex workers' rights movement, is not totally new. However, the increasing visibility of the women's movements and other movements offered sex workers not just a network of individuals to support their cause, but also activist strategies and a window of opportunity for engaging themselves in activism. Beyond France in the 1970s, in many places there was an increasing push to decriminalize sex work. To give an example, in 1973, the National Organization of Women now adopted a resolution calling for the decriminalization of sex work. That resolution was sort of repealed or substituted by another one focusing on trafficking women in 1986, and it was brought in by Kathleen Barry, and Kathleen Barry is one of the other important actors in this story. So Barry's conceptualization of paid sex as female sexual slavery gained momentum after the publication of an article in Ms. Magazine in November 1979, and the book carrying the same title. While Barry wished to resurrect the notion of enslavement through prostitution without falling into the racialized trope of 19th and early 20th century white slavery rhetoric, her narrative actually reproduced it. Female sexual slavery invariably seemed to happen on African territory or in the so-called, quote, North African Quarter in Paris. Its victims were at the time still imagined to be overwhelmingly white European women lured and kidnapped into prostitution or, quote, Arab harems. Barry also recounts the story told by Herzog in 1975 and locates it in Paris, reframing it, among other things, as terrorism. Quote, female sexual slavery allowed Barry to reintroduce into political debates the idea of the completely passive and hopelessly traumatized victims. When she pitched her article and book to Ms. Magazine, nobody seemed to have heard of the issue before, and the movement had been focusing on other issues of sexual violence, rape, and battered women. So the issue of prostitution, whether coerced or not, seemed to be very far away from these women, and this required fashioning a strategy that made readers at home feel emotionally connected to it and fear to become possible victims. The narrative strategy to make adopted relied on the complementary representation of two others, the enslaved and by definition passive and voiceless sex slave, and the racialized other of the pimp as supposedly embodied by Muslim and/or migrants from African countries in the Western world. The transnational political relevance of the article, however, lies not just in its framing, but in fact that it was a call to activism. It is unclear to me at this point how concerted and organized this call was, but at the end of the article, in the 1979 article, readers were invited to send letters to the UN and specifically to the Commission on the Status of Women, mention the article and call for action at the UN level. This succeeded. An extensive summary of 5 letters was included in the official documentation of the Commission on the Status of Women of the session of 1980. When Barry applied in early 1980, so just later, for a presentation and workshop to be held during the Second World Women's Conference in Copenhagen, she included a copy of this documentation as proof of her expertise and political relevance. Approved by the United Nations, Barry was encouraged to give the workshop together with back then Secretary General of the Anti-Slavery Society, which picks up the connection between, of course, prostitution and slavery. I have not yet been able to find out more about the contents of the workshop during the Copenhagen conference. What I know is that Barry was not the only one working on sexual labor in Copenhagen. In fact, Barry's attempt to build a feminist anti-trafficking movement network and her workshop seems to have been interrupted on many occasions by women from the British Wages for Housework campaign, and in particular by activist Selma James. James was not a declared prostitute, but she strove to build a movement which fought to abolish all laws against prostitutes and had been closely working with the English Collective of Prostitutes. Her interruption created a discussion on questions around tactics and whether or not it was justifiable and acceptable to disrupt other people's workshops, and in this case, anti-trafficking activists. And this led to an interesting turn of events. The National Task Force on Prostitution, a working group of NOW, closely working with Coyote founder Margus and James, produced a statement in which St. James sided with Kathleen Barry on the question of tactics employed by Selma James. Well, there's probably much more to this story, and Barry and St. James didn't remain friends. I use this point to illustrate how alliances aren't fixed and how certain political arenas, such as the global arena of the World Women's Conference, favored some activist tactics over others. Well, Barry actively had appropriated the legacy of Butler's abolitionisms, so the early abolitionism. Her critical focus on discriminatory aspects of law and policing never went beyond state regulation or legalization. She wanted to abolish prostitution as a practice. The incipient sex workers' rights movement specifically targeted laws against prostitutes and opposed jail sentences. They also moved beyond framing coerced prostitution as torture and slavery, which they didn't question. They used a human rights framework to claim positive rights, and they called for civil, social, and economic rights for the specific case of the prostitute and prostitution. Moving a little bit outside of the framework of the World Women's Conferences, in 1986 there was a so-called Second World Horse Congress held at the European Parliament, where the International Committee for Prostitutes' Rights presented a statement on prostitution and human rights, asserting that prostitutes be granted, quote, be granted the same human rights as every other citizen. They called for the acceptance of the right to work as a prostitute to be on an equal basis as the right not to work as a prostitute, and therefore called for an unequal recognition of prostitutes as bearer of human rights. So in conclusion, the paper illustrates how politics and discourses of sexual labor often sometimes overlapped, and discourses of coercion met in different arenas, but also shifted over time. Rather than being static, they were formed and shaped into continued interaction among activists in various political arenas. Both the anti-trafficking movement inaugurated by Herzog and then Barry and the sex workers' rights movement are linked to earlier abolitionist demands against state-regulated prostitution, albeit in increasingly oppositional terms. The question for me is then whether it is desirable to reconstruct a debate in binary terms that assume a divide that may not yet have